Hello Year 10. We're going to be looking at how to analyse and use the sources for your Introduction to Legal Studies argumentative essay. You can use the principle of ILAC that Mrs. Lafell outlined in the assignment overview video for both structuring your essay and for analysing your sources. Firstly, when you're looking at the sources, either singly or across the range of sources for the issue you have chosen, you're looking to identify at least one legal or human rights issue. That will then also go into your introductory paragraph for your essay. In your sources, you're considering from there whether somebody's human rights have been breached or whether that person has suffered as a result of the breach. So in your sources, you're looking for a specific issue. That's just how we looked at finding a challenge by looking at the sources in geography in term 1. You're then going to look at the sources and the information you've identified and figure out whether any legislation or a legal principle is relevant to that issue. So it might be that you consider the rule of law principle, that everyone should be treated the same before the law, has not been respected, and that's part of the issue. Or you might consider that someone's basic human rights have not been regarded, and you would need to consider this legislation, or perhaps the UN Declaration of Human Rights, as to whether a certain human right has not been respected. You could go to the Queensland Human Rights Act. You will find that in the argumentative essay tile on NEST, down here. In there, you'll find on the right-hand side an index that you can have a look through. For example, the right to education and the right to health services. That may assist you with determining if a particular human right has not been respected. You may also want to consider something like the Racial Discrimination Act. Now, that one does open up to quite a different type of site from Amnesty that gives an overview and lots of information. It could take you a little while to look through that. There's also a link to the Queensland Anti-Discrimination Act, which is the actual legislation that you would see. There again is an index at the beginning, and you can look through and go, oh, okay, I want to think that maybe people have been discriminated against, and that's part of the act that they have not respected or followed in this law or principle. You then need to think, given the information you have in your sources, what would be the two opposing stakeholders' perspectives, at least? So, for example, Indigenous Australians and governments. If you were looking at employment, perhaps you might also consider employers or a business perspective. If you were looking at education, maybe you'd be thinking about schools of all different types or universities. So have a think, given the information you have in those sources, who these stakeholders are and how they're impacted given the current situation. Application and arguments you also need to consider is what's happening just and equitable, and if not, is there any hint or evidence in the sources as to why not? And the conclusion is that, based on your analysis of all the relevant sources, you can sum up what are the legal or human rights issues that are being or not being addressed at the present time. A couple of other sources you may want to look at before we move on to an example is Ken Wyatt's Key Points for Effecting Change and the Indigenous-led Solutions for Closing the Gap. They can give you a little bit more of background there as well. All right, so let's look at some actual sources. In your assignment, you have been given a range of stimulus. Now, those stimulus cover a range of health, wealth, and education topics. These first two sources, try and get this to work. Source 1 is just a background to our Australian rights and values. Source 2 is an extract from the Closing the Gap report. It gives us an overview on what Closing the Gap is about. We then have a series of sources on employment, including graphs, text, 2 maps to compare. Yes, I know I'm scrolling through these quickly. We then have a section on health, focusing particularly on the issue of child mortality rates. So the number of children who die per 100,000 live births in a year. And it compares Indigenous and non-Indigenous rates. We then have information on literacy and numeracy, which is a specific Closing the Gap target. There are key points, what the data tells us, a little cartoon there that's worth looking at for all topics, to be honest, and then a Closing the Gap report infographic. If you are wanting more detail on the Closing the Gap report, you can look at these 2 items on the Closing Argumentative Essay tile. That give you an overview or the full report. It is not essential, but the information is there as a backup for you. So let's have a look at, as an example, at the information that's given to us on employment. I'm only going to choose the 2 maps as an example to show you what we can look at. So I'm going to be applying the principles of ILAC. And my first is I'm looking for an issue. In here, I've got Indigenous employment rates for people of working age by jurisdiction. That means by state and also by remoteness. When I look at the key, this is the area that gives me an idea of whether a place is regional Australia, which means it's not that far from major centres, or whether it's very remote, and I'd need to look carefully at these hashtags. This is the percentage of people who are actually employed. Okay, so in this case, this is Indigenous employment rates. And we can see, for example, that in very remote Australia, like Western Australia, less than 30% of people are employed. That means 70% or more of Indigenous Australians in this area don't have a job. Now we've got this down here compared to non-Indigenous employment rates. By the same thing, we've got remoteness and percent employed. If we have a look in the same area of Western Australia over here, we can see that more than 60% of non-Indigenous Australians in the same area are employed. Here is an issue that there are much higher rates of unemployment among Indigenous Australians than non-Indigenous Australians, and particularly in remote areas. So there's my first thing. I've got my issue is higher rates of Indigenous unemployment. In the same area. So that's my issue. Now if I'm going to look at the L for legislation or principles, then I need to go back and have a look at some of the sources that we have here. Am I going to be looking at, maybe this is a case of discrimination, perhaps racial discrimination. Maybe it's not a just and equitable principle or rule of law. So I'll need to do a little bit of investigating to think what legal principle or legislation is appropriate here. So I'm going to go with the principle that this hasn't been just and equitable. It hasn't been fair. There's obviously something going on here. That's why Indigenous employment rates are so much lower than those for non-Indigenous Australians. Now I'm looking at my application and arguments. To take you back to that, I'm looking at stakeholders' perspectives. Who's involved and what might be their perspective? So one stakeholder I might have is the government. So the government might have the idea that perhaps they are having programs focused in towns and cities because it's easier to deliver those programs in areas of higher population. Please excuse the mess on the screen. I might also have the perspective of Indigenous Australians. Maybe a lot of them are living in these areas because of a connection to country and for cultural reasons. Why should they be disadvantaged simply because they're choosing to live in an area to which they have a spiritual and cultural connection? Maybe also I'm talking about a third perspective who are employers. And the employers are going, well, I don't know how to employ Indigenous Australians. I don't know how to connect to them. They haven't had enough education. I'm just going to bring in the specialist fly-in, fly-out workers. So I'm starting to look there at the arguments from either side. Again, that's going to bring me back to, is this just and equitable? And lastly, from these two maps, I'm going to draw the conclusion, as we'll see back here on the PowerPoint, that my summary of my findings is that this is a serious issue because if we don't have Indigenous Australians employed at the same rate as non-Indigenous Australians, then we are having a serious level of disadvantage in this community, perhaps higher levels of poverty and disengagement and long-term unemployment, which has an effect on communities. I would start thinking about my recommendations about, well, okay, how can we get employment into these communities? And I might have a look at Ken Wyatt's points and also the Closing the Gap solutions over here from the SBS article and start thinking about, okay, we could do that, or maybe there's something else I could look at. You don't have to come up with something brilliantly new. You can extend or build on what's already being done. You would then repeat this process for the other information that you have on the employment target, doing that individually, and then going overall, this is the issue, this is what the stakeholders think, this is what I'm considering as a recommendation to government to address this issue. Okay, that is everything for this particular video. If you have any questions, please be sure to contact your teacher and make sure that you talk through this analysis.